Stop it. Good afternoon. My name's Richard Mull.
Why don't we
Let them go.
Yeah, why don't we just take a minute? If everyone could sit down and be quiet.
Rowdy sediment.
Give Richard your full attention.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name's Richard Mullane. I'm from Hassell, and it's very exciting to be here today to present the final outcomes of our design stage and our vision for a resilient South City. We've come a long way. We've come a very, very long way over the last year. I'm particularly thankful to our amazing team that's developed all the work I'm going to share with you today, and they're going to join me on stage for questions shortly, and I'll be throwing all the difficult ones to them. And also to some of my Hassell colleagues that are watching the live stream in Australia and also in our Asian studios today. We have together been focused on achieving the inspiring vision that drew us to this challenge 1 year ago. And that vision is really about innovative community-based solutions to sea level rise, severe storms, flooding and earthquakes. And design can only be really effective in these serious problems if it also is improving the daily experiences of people. There's one team member that couldn't be here with us today because he's in class, and I'm going to let Sultan tell you a little bit more about the project.
This is a story about a little city called South San Francisco, built next to a bay a long, long time ago. A story about this city and that bay, but in a different time, when storms, floods, earthquakes, and other natural disasters were happening more and more often. A time that would call on all the communities that lived around this bay to share all of their past experiences and make plans for the potential disasters of the future. Together, designing ways to become more resilient, becoming resilient by design. And they discovered an answer so simple that they felt like they should have known it all along. The answer was something that they all loved, but sometimes forgot how valuable it could be. The answer was green, and kind of empty, and could be almost anything they needed if they put their mind to it. It was something that made their lives better today, and made them better able to respond to disasters in the future. Although only one bay, its shoreline was diverse and stretched 500 miles, and at its edge had grown lots and lots of cities, some big, some small, but all connected by that one bay. And to find their solution, they first tried to better understand their shared problems.
So today I'm going to take you through the process, the collective design process that we as a team have been working our way through over the last year. I'm going to begin by outlining our regional analysis. So the process that we went through to understand the bay as a whole and some of the challenges and common challenges shared across the bay. But then I'm going to turn to South City and the community there, the way that we engaged with them, the ideas that they gave us, the way that they contributed to our understanding of their challenges. And then after that, I'm going to talk to two scales of the project. In dealing with creating resiliency in South City and Coma Creek, we've looked at the entire watershed, and we've also focused on the most critically vulnerable area, which is Coma Creek. So we began this process with one of the most amazing site visits that our team had ever experienced. It was 4 weeks of a curated tour of exemplar projects around the bay and some of the most vulnerable sites and communities. And then beyond that was detailed data analysis, identifying some of the challenges brought on by climate change to communities around the bay, but also identifying existing challenges to life by the bay, for some that will be exacerbated by rising tides. We've identified 4 key insights, and I'm going to keep them very short. Firstly, it's creekside and shoreline areas that are vulnerable, and there's a triple threat. It's flooding, sea level rise, and liquefaction. So it's clear from the creek flooding FEMA maps, as well as the assets and communities that are at risk by sea level rise and the liquefaction hazard zones, that these 3 risks are all entwined, and they make areas that are particularly vulnerable based on that triple threat as I described it. Secondly, restoration projects need to better engage local communities and also embrace educational functions. So we've talked a lot about the Baylands, This is a really ambitious project of a huge scale. At the same time, the population of this region is growing very, very quickly. And the Bay Trail is 500 miles in circumference, and it's really responsible for connecting those communities to that Baylands project. But if the Baylands project, which was created out of a social movement here, doesn't adapt to the new population that inhabits this region, then it will never happen. And then on top of that, there's sea level rise to deal with. So for us, the key insight is the third one. There's a lack of parks and public access to the shoreline. It's really, really obvious to us as outsiders coming to this region. This is a key social equity issue. Access to public open space and access to the waterfront should be a right. And we can see that when we look at the most vulnerable communities that are along the shoreline, when we look at the transit infrastructure, the freeways that ring the bay. It's amazing that they're still there. And in a place where the first settlers of this region really understood the value of the shoreline, it's incredible that you've actually since then lost the number of valuable community spaces around the bay. There's much less than there was many, many years ago. And finally, this is a problem that's not going to be solved by regional governance. We realise that regional governance just is not able to lead the solution. It's a neighbourhood-led solution. It's got to be scalable, it has to be connected to transit, to open space, and build social resiliency. So even though people commute in a regional way, it's the diversity of cities that has to become the strength of the solution. It's the diversity of communities, and it's building on the fine-grained neighbourhood assets like schools and libraries. So as Sultan mentioned in the video, the Bay Area is no stranger to disasters. And we've got floods, drought, earthquakes here. We've also included tech companies starting up. That's technically not a disaster, but it's certainly a disruption. But have our needs in disaster really changed that much from 1906 and the earthquake to last year's North Bay fires? We would argue that they haven't. We would argue that people still need space. They need space to take refuge, to look after each other, and to regroup. Public space is critical. And sadly, we don't make as much of it as we used to. So we've started by looking at the existing infrastructure patterns that happen around the bay. The freeways, the public transit, the priority development zones, they're all loops, like a circuit formed around the bay, vulnerable to breaks in one point. And we've looked for opportunities to create new public space on the shoreline, in the town centres and uphill. And that space is there to collect people, to collect water, and for use in disasters. But it's also ecological space, as I'll get to later on. And then we've looked to opportunities to connect these spaces from the ridgeline to the shoreline. So we're looking at key streets, community streets, we're looking at creeks, and really opening up those connections in order to create a network, a single resilient bay-wide network from neighbourhood projects all the way to something singular that joins us as a region. So South City, well, it's a unique place. It's a small community, but it's typical of some of the smaller communities and growing cities in the region in some of the challenges it's facing. 43% of its population were born outside of the US. It's adjacent to the region's largest airport. It's also home to some extremely vulnerable neighbourhoods, particularly within the downtown area. So it's a place balancing a strong history and also rapid change. And it's a place that's very much was ready for a community conversation about these issues. So that's what we did. We took an old building, a 100-year-old building in the main street, and it had been empty for 20 years, and we opened it up 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. And we allowed the community to drop in to learn about some of the research that we'd done, but really to help us to learn about some of the challenges they were facing and to help us kind of shape the project day by day. And we built something together. We covered the main wall in a map, and the community filled that wall day by day with their comments, suggestions, hopes and dreams. From local youth to business owners, people were incredibly open and generous with their time, and they became engaged and invested in the design process for a project they didn't realise was possible. So we opened the doors of that space in a public event back in March, We also then kept them open for 2.5 months, and we had a range of events and made the space available to community groups. We worked in the space ourselves. It was a design studio as well. And we hosted all of the stakeholders for meetings there, with the community comments on display permanently right next to those meetings. And there was quite a few stakeholders. We held dozens of meetings there, but we also worked very closely with the city and the county in our working group, and we're very thankful to their input throughout the process and their support. We'd like to acknowledge 3 key community partners that worked very closely with us. The South San Francisco Historical Society filled the space with historic maps and photos and stories from local residents. The Youth Leadership Institute every Friday, they brought South City High students into the space where we talked about environmental justice, planning and equity, and also active mobility. And mostly we'd like to thank the San Bruno Mountain Watch, who filled the space with plants that were native from that watershed. They also took tours of local high school students from the mountain, looking down on the watershed all the way down to the shoreline, and then came into the shop front to fill the map with suggestions. So Ariel Chabowski's here today, and he's going to join us on stage afterwards for questions. But this whole process is essentially about people. It's about their stories, and about their stories revealing their challenges, but also their aspirations. And this is a pretty grim competition or challenge in some ways, but it can also be pretty optimistic in terms of the change that there's potential for here. We didn't want one-off community meetings. We wanted to embed ourselves in the community. We wanted to really draw out these stories and then have them inspire our process. And they added depth to our analytical research. So the city was originally built at the turn of the century next to a marshland that connected at the bottom of Coma Creek to the bay. There were a number of wells built for access to fresh groundwater as well, which are those dots you can see. An entire watershed between San Bruno Mountain and the San Andreas Fault drains to a single creek. This is a huge area, and there's very unique geology here, which means that those wells have led to a much depleted aquifer, and it's actually quite hard to put water back into that aquifer because only certain places are possible. So we're not just making bias whales anywhere. It's much more complex than that in the Bay Area. A number of cities drain into the creek, and today those cities have a rough balance of jobs and housing, or jobs and residents, but in true Bay Area style, people don't live and work here. So they all experience long regional commutes because of a skills mismatch between the industry and the residents. But interestingly, around 70% of the trips within South San Francisco are only 5 miles. So this is a place that's small enough that could have a kind of walking and biking lifestyle, and that's something we saw as an opportunity. And it looks like a green place, but it's not, because the green space is not usable. What you see here is the mountain, the San Bruno Mountain, which is not typical recreational space, and then you see a huge amount of cemeteries within Coma, and then you see a golf course. So the one park, which is kind of on the creek in the centre of the image, much beloved Orange Memorial Park, is really all there is. And South City people love their sports. They are very, very keen on their baseball, on their soccer, and also on their community swimming pool. So this is kind of why it's a real problem that when we compare to other cities in San Mateo County, they do not have enough sporting facilities. They also have some of the higher rates of youth obesity in the county as well. So as the stormwater system's grown and grown without green space within this water catchment, there's been more and more water going into the creek. There's also been groundwater being pumped at the same time, and the water treatment plant puts out around about 7 times as much water on rainy days than it does on dry days, which tells you that there's a risk of subsidence from water being pulled out of the ground. And all of this water on the surface is essentially funneling down towards the lower creek where it stops. And the community had lots of stories about flooding. Everybody had a story about losing a car. Different years, slightly different spots, but always at that point in the lower creek. And that's the same point where the town grew over the marsh, as you remember from earlier. So what's happened to Carl's walk to that sunny Bay Beach? Well, this is what it looks like now, and Carl couldn't even walk along the side of this concrete channel. the edges of which are defined by pumps and concrete walls. So this area is the city's most vulnerable. It's also home to some of the kind of key urban functions, though, and you can probably see them a bit better on this map, where you can see the biotech hub, the world's third biggest biotech hub, is there with Genentech on the north side of the creek. There's SFO Airport, there's Produce Market 101, the Caltrain. There's also lots of local assets, Costco, the local water treatment plant that's treating water from several cities surrounding. And aside from the FEMA flood zone, there's also the sea level rise risk and liquefaction as well. So when we look to the land use in these areas, it's primarily industrial uses at risk, some associated with the neighbouring airport, some potentially important to the growing biotech hub as the last land available there, and some the industrial employment base, which is important for this community known as the industrial city. There's no east-west access across this corridor. There's the highway, the Caltrain, a number of streets blocking people walking or driving across this corridor. And you can understand how constricted it is when you look at the water flow, which we've done. Here, a 10-year flood. This is a sectional diagram showing the water coming underneath some of these streets, and with sea level rise connecting all the way up to Orange Memorial Park, having an impact on the creek, you can see a 100-year event with sea level rise is catastrophic, and none of those bridges allow for the flow of water underneath, which means these properties get inundated. So it's a complex problem, and that water flow model, as well as the many community observations, have helped us understand it even further. But as Sultan explained, when we get to our solution, we think it's a relatively simple and understandable principle. The solution's simple: public space is critical to resilience, improving the daily lives of communities, as well as allowing them to respond to disaster. So if we look to all of the green space and public open space that we can access, we start with the parks, but then the key opportunity we found was the schools. So extending our catchment of people that can walk to a community space, building on the Parks Department in South City, who already use the 2 high schools for programming of sports that can't fit in the parks, but taking this further. But also, I mentioned Ariel and the San Bruno Mountain Watch. They've done incredible work restoring the mountain's ecology. And we want to build upon this and extend this down the entire watershed all the way to the shoreline along the creek. So building huge awareness about resilience through native plants and plants that are very specific to this local area. So what we establish is a network, a resilience network that collects and connects layers of water, ecology, community, and emergency. So the collectors are parks and schools, and the connectors are green streets, adapted freight corridors, and a new Coma Creek. And there's all of these key places that we've looked to create adaptations across the watershed, but they happen in 4 separate layers. So firstly, with water, collecting and recharging at points of suitable geology next to the mountain, collecting, treating and reusing at schools, slowing it down in the streets that run to the creek where there's existing pipes, and discharging into creekside parks to try and infiltrate or overflow into a widened Coma Creek. Recharge reservoirs, we think, could become gateways to the mountain. The learning hubs, this could be the first place that some South City kids really come in contact with nature, and it really draws them up into that mountain as a kind of backyard of nature play. Then ecology. To restore ecology, further habitat for the mountain's mission blue butterfly, bringing natives into the schoolyard, local streets connecting as ecology corridors between the schools and the creeks, and steelhead trout returning up restored Coma Creek. For us, this is really critical. This is both a natural place, but it's a social place. And sometimes in this region, those things butt heads, but it's really important that we try to find ways for them to fit together. And places for community to come together for education or exercise in nature, utilising school grounds over more hours to connect people with their neighbours, and to connect kids to their schools for a safe ride, and across town or along Coma Creek. So adapting streets to safe and shaded routes to school. These are short distances. It could really improve health but also it gives people a connection to their future points of emergency access. The schools are a real asset as emergency hubs that could be adapted. We're working with existing programs in the city and the county about taking refuge at schools and having people know about those refuge points, which they don't at the moment, and also understanding the capacity of each of those refuge points. And opening up those schools to recreation on times that they're not in class is really key to building social connections that enable this to happen. And this is what they'd be like. There'd be places with access to water, energy and other emergency facilities, but they'd also would be implementing and building bridges between the school district and the city as well. So a network that's all aimed at building connections, access to resilience for people across the entire watershed, but it's also aimed essentially at stopping water from going into the creek, or at least slowing it down. So if we get to our kind of key vulnerable corridor, it's a place that everybody knew about and they all talked about, and our idea is about turning a point of vulnerability into potentially the biggest opportunity. We imagine Coma Creek as a continuous restored green corridor of connected projects anchored at one end by the much beloved Orange Park and at the other by a new public open space destination on the bay, reconnecting the city with the bay. We've proposed a singular public corridor for walking and cycling from park to park, from pool to pool, reinstating the lost micro-delta connections as easements and all connections both for water and for people. So it begins with an upgraded Orange Park. So this is built upon the city's existing master plan for extended sports facilities, so new soccer fields, new baseball fields. It's also building upon work that's being done by our team members Lotus Water and Brown and Caldwell, looking to treat, store and reuse creek water, and that's being funded by Caltrans because that's runoff treatment mitigation. But further to the plan, what we're proposing is just a simple gesture of lowering those playing fields. 3 feet lowered in one baseball field could potentially save a road or a number of industrial properties downstream, and it's something we've started to talk to the community about. The second project is a widened and greened Coma Creek. So through the removal of South Canal Road and lowering and extending Sister Cities Park along the creek side, we're utilising industrial plots then on either side, which are already earmarked for rezoning in the short term, to deliver mixed development that would set back from the creek. So working with existing landholders to exchange rezonings for public benefit, convincing the city to say, do not rezone this land into residential until we can allocate the portion next to the creek for public space. And a relatively simple project, widening the channel to kind of increase capacity whilst also creating a continuous safe cycling route, taking down the walls, greening the creeks, bringing native species through this corridor, and really turning South City back towards its creek. It's a place that the city's turned its back on. We're proposing that we turn it around. And then at the 101, we're overcoming major infrastructure blockages with an iconic pedestrian and cycling loop. It's formed by remnant freight lines and easements. It's a connection over the rail corridor, the 101, and multiple roads, but it connects the city to its Caltrain station, which is stuck within this island. It also connects the employees and the workers over on the east side in the biotech hub across to the city to come across and spend their money. And it creates continuous access along the creek. The idea is that it would be funded through a joint benefit, a partnership with Caltrans to create a floodplain for the water in the creek that can't get under the 101, but also as natural treatment for runoff coming off that highway. But also it's a partnership with community to create a nursery where all of those restoration plants would be hosted and a gateway to the city for people to understand what this project's about. It's an iconic project, but it's also hopefully a daily experience, and we imagine people simply riding their bikes from the park at one end all the way down to the bay and the pool at the other end. So working with the county, the airport and this water quality control plant at the bottom of South City, we've developed a plan for a new eco-water park. So a place of ecological habitat creation, natural final stage treatment, water education and water recreation. It's a new public space on the bay for South City and for the region, and it's a critical point of the watershed where it meets the bay. So it's an opportunity to it's natural treatment and emergency storage for the treatment plant. It could be funded through certain environmental grants associated with that, but it's also an active public shoreline destination for the community. So at the moment it's a bus depot right on the bay. What a shame. This is such a great opportunity for people and for this community to get in touch with the waterfront and also to engage in this conversation about adapting to sea level rise. And you can swim in the bay. That would be amazing. That's what really motivated us. Imagine in another 50 years a South Sydney child telling the same story that Carl told. It seems a long way off, but to us we think it's quite achievable. And then finally, the double threat that people have been talking about stormwater release and also about sea level rise is a key concern. In the long term, we're looking for a solution that balances that extreme stormwater and sea level rise at the same time. This is wetland restoration in the short term, but eventually a living levee. And a storm gate. So what we need to do, we think, is to build capacity for stormwater to be held within this area when we get a future king tide. And it's a key area of concern to the airport as a critical partner to this project. And if this doesn't happen, they've said they may have to look at building a barrier on their inside edge. So they're already building a barrier to the bay for sea level rise, but this is the kind of second stage of stopping that fluvial flooding coming over onto the backside of the airport, but actually stopping the airport from having to cut themselves off from the community. So it's habitat, it's water management, it's education, it's recreation, it's all these things coming together. But it's a public place for people by the bay at the end of a greened, restored, connected corridor. We believe that this small little city could have a massive impact on the bay through both the scalability of this project for other troubled creekside communities, but also because the direct impact that a small little city can have on the gateway to this entire region right next to it, or to this biotech hub right at the shoreline. We cannot separate neighbourhood projects from regional infrastructure, but we have to start from the bottom up. Thank you. Thanks. You're in charge.
Make sure you're standing
In the light. Cheers. You can stand on the mat, that's okay.
Maybe more comment than a question, but I was glad to hear that one of the principles you're leading with was the idea of incorporating pedestrian and cycle routes of movement. It wasn't as thoroughly explored because you had so much else to talk about, but I get the sense that it underpins the rest. Because I guess through the course of the day so far, I think we've talked so much about how communities can rebuild in the face of current and impending crises, but perhaps less. It may have been left a bit more tacit. The idea that we also need to rebuild places and systems that don't contribute to the further degradation of these crises. So, like low carbon economies, for example. I know that's so much of a catchphrase, but I think you begin to touch on some of that, and I don't know if you want to talk more about those forms of alternative mobility at a local level, or, sorry, it's more of a comment than a question. But does that spur anyone else? have a question?
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about cycling, pedestrians, and cycling. I mean, I think that it's an opportunity. South Sydney is a smaller city, and sometimes in this region, you look at that commuter map, you know, these bigger cities are just like huge magnets that are really sometimes causing bad outcomes for smaller cities. The advantages that South Sydney has, it has great bones. It's got an amazing main street where we were. It's got real diversity of food offer along there. And we had school kids coming in that were just walking from their school to the main street. So it's got this scale that we wanted to unlock with pedestrian and cycle infrastructure. Maybe Thomas can talk about some of the ways we discussed it. There's a whole range of freight lines on east of 101 that are just waiting to connect those biotech workers back to the downtown. But there's all sorts of things that we developed.
Yeah, as an outsider coming from the Netherlands, my heart was kind of bleeding in talking to these school kids living with a 1 mile radius from their school and not walking or cycling to school. While you have, as Richard was saying, while you have this actually pretty good grid that you can use and take benefit of. And I also want to stress that cycling is not only about recreation, but it's actually about these daily trips. As Richard showed, it was maybe not emphasized, but 70% of all trips is actually within 5 miles. And I think it's even bay-wide. You have these kind of numbers, so there's actually tremendous opportunity there to go to work, to go to school, to go to the shops, and it's all very kind of easy, kind of small things you can do. So there's a lot to gain there, actually, and then tackling the root causes of kind of climate change, as you emphasized. I fully agree.
Yeah, and also we're lucky that the ferry routes in South City actually have the highest number of people with bikes on them. When people get off the ferry, they either get straight onto a shuttle that takes them to one of those biotech companies, or they've got their bike because they need it. And so what we were interested in was like, we've got BART, we've got Caltrain, we've got ferry, but they're all just too spread out, just that little bit too spread out. So it's partly about the cycling routes, but then it's also about, can you park bikes at those stations? Can you take them on those services?
The connection, collecting connect network, I thought was really incredible on multiple levels. From starting up upstream, coming all the way downstream. And it all seemed like it really was woven together really well on multiple levels. My question is about going forward and the stewardship of this. Who within the community has ownership of this, and how will it move forward? And what are some of the first initial projects that you might begin to implement? That wasn't clear to me.
Yeah, so in terms of stewardship and immediate, like the near-term wins, the way that we've approached this is, it's been very complicated because we're not talking about people's houses that are flooding, so it's hard to get them involved, but we've understood some of the challenges, the concerns that they have about growth in the city. And green space and parks is really something that they're passionate about once they know that they're coming. So we're not trying to have fixed designs of these parks, but there's a whole range of people that are interested in starting a conversation about how that green space is shaped, whether it's baseball fields or playgrounds or its ecology. And we were really lucky to meet Ariel. We found that he'd done a presentation on Coma Creek at the local library last year. Nobody connected us with him. We had to find that information, and when we contacted him, I think San Bruno Mountain Watch, although quite far from the bottom reaches of the creek, is actually the group that's really, most able to carry it forward. So maybe Ariel, you can talk about your experiences.
Hi everyone. And when I see all these projects, this one and all the rest, it seems like these projects need a lot of people with, orange vests and hard hats. And we really see the opportunity to engage, the hands and hearts of local people. So many of these solutions, like was simply put, it's just about making this area more green, having green, gardens that can help collect and slow down water, We have a native plant nursery that collects and grows plants from the watershed. And we're a tiny staff of 2 in my nonprofit, so all our work is done with the community, residents from South City, Daly City, Colma, Brisbane. We want to see those people engaged in this project by helping grow the plants that would bring the green, the green areas back to this land. And also, Colma Creek starts up on San Bruno Mountain as it makes its way to the bay. We do restoration work on the headwaters of Colma Creek. We bring schools up there, as does the county parks. But we want to have a wholesome watershed education program where we can, like we did with this project, bring students up to the mountain, see how beautiful and lush the creek is up there, but also see how the mountain could be a partner to this project, how the resources on the mountain could help give back to the local community. This mountain was almost destroyed, cut down, and put in the bay as a plan back in the day. And so we'd see it as a really beautiful opportunity for this mountain that was saved by folks from my group, from people from South City, to have the mountain then give back to the city that almost came over it.
Yeah, so I think the real enlightening moment for us as a team was when seeing the way that Ariel engaged with school students and how engaged and interested they were in what he's doing. And then when we saw the lack of green space and connected that to the schools, it's clear that it's going to be young people and that are going to drive this project, which is great because it's going to take a very long time. And first steps. We have a whole range of drawings that we presented at the interim that we'd really worked through in detail with the city. Some of the first steps are very, very simple. Taking out South Canal Road, which is duplicated on the other side of the canal, and lowering that, and also the existing bike corridor would add a huge amount of capacity to the creek, and also continuous cycling from the park all the way to Linden, so we're halfway there. And we think that's something that could happen immediately.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I deeply appreciate the focus on walkability, cycling, and starting with public space. However, I'm missing a little bit sort of the overarching vision or idea about workplaces, because you mentioned as well that one of the big problems in the Bay Area is the fact that people are not living where the work is, and they have very long commutes. So starting with the pedestrian and bike infrastructure and public space sort of points to a completely different or a complete change in lifestyle for this region, where ideally you would be able to live closer to your work or work closer to where you live. So what are you imagining in terms of the future of this area, of kinds of workplaces, and how are these things going to change in your mind?
I think I mentioned the disjoint between the east and west sides of 101. There's a huge amount of educated and well-paid workers in the research fields that are catching ferries and Caltrain, or just getting on buses that are taking them from San Francisco and other places to those campuses. And then there's this industrial base which is kind of fading. It seems like the decisions that people are making about where to live is based on affordability, and they're still driving. So getting people out of their cars and also changing choices about where they can and might live is kind of, they're intertwined, and it's hard to separate those two things. We have talked a lot with the city about maintaining, we had an exercise in the storefront where we would have people, the sign says South San Francisco, the industrial city, and we'd have people put up another word for what could the city be. That was actually a little more complicated than it sounds. It sounds just like a feel-good exercise. But a lot of people work in those industrial areas. So what we're talking about is allowing a city to evolve, that industry to evolve. And that's probably the second phase of that project along Colma Creek, is how you manage that. And there's a general plan update happening starting next year, and the city's going to use this work to inform that. And there's some real conversations about whether you can mix industrial and residential, whether you don't have to sacrifice jobs to have more people living downtown in a walkable environment. We think you can. And also, what's the future of that industry? Because the biggest constraint on land use in South City in that flooding zone is actually parking. Because of the airport, parking is incredibly valuable within this city, and that's parking, cemeteries, and big box factories. That's what we're dealing with. So the economics is quite complex, and we're encouraging the city to not rezone until it's the right point in time. And that might mean that the change in some of that land use is a bit slower, which is why the creek has to happen now.
You mentioned the airport, and SFO is a neighbor of yours, and that both of the Bay's major airports are going to have major challenges with sea level rise, not only flooding of runways, but getting passengers and workers to and from their terminals. Is the SFO a partner with you guys?
Yeah, they've been engaged since the initial kickoff meeting that we had with all the stakeholders, but we've also been meeting with them to understand their plans. They've actually been they fully understand that challenge of parking that I mentioned. And, you know, on the shoreline next to this park, there's a private developer building, another 5-storey parking building on the waterfront. And SFO is very supportive. They understand what that does to the community there. And they were supportive enough to say, well, we can put them out of business if we just change our price structure. So we could have an empty parking lot building there right next to our shoreline pool. But yeah, they've been supportive mostly about, they're very efficient with their space. It's an airport on a postage stamp, effectively. It's one of the most efficient in the world for the number of passengers it deals with. So that's great for South Sydney and other neighbouring cities, but also this shoreline collector, if they could build amenity and public destinations out of the money they would have spent on a wall, that's an incredible outcome for this community. Yeah, go for it.
SFO is one of the asset owners that we see as being critical to the funding strategy, and not so much just funding, but aligning the investments that they're already making, Caltrans, SFO, the water district, to integrate these multiple benefits that we've identified through this design concept.
Yeah, and Supervisor Pine might.
I represent the city of South San Francisco on the Board of Supervisors, and just 2 quick points. The airport's been keenly interested in this area for some time, and some years prior to this RBD exercise contributed to a study of resiliency and sea level rise risks in the Colma Creek where it interfaces with the bay. And then also I would just point out that the city of South San Francisco is really entering a period of great transformation. Traditionally, everything new has been on the east side of the highway, but when you go down 101 now, you'll see some substantial housing, and there's a lot more planned. And I think a lot of that would potentially be tied into the design ideas that you've heard today.
So, thank you for that, because that's a part of my question is a little more information on the urban and social dynamics of the city, because we saw the designs, I think, but the principles are, I try to, from what I read and what you said, but you need more space for water, you need more space, you need more bikes, you need more, schools that are open, more, and so forth. It's a lot of improvement. At the same time, you need a certain dynamics for that. Because if the city does not change by itself, all of a sudden, this design exercise becomes, like
the city's
driving a design through the throat of a, standstill truck, which is complex. So you need the dynamics. So I need to know where.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah,
because I think the designs are even less important than the intervention strategies behind them to open up that space, to ensure that the water can go somewhere, that there is a different type of culture around mobility. So that's one. And the second question is, and you touched upon it a little with zoning, but there could be what are the instruments you have next to a good idea? What are the instruments you have to get people out of their cars and on their bikes? Or, there's only one example, but there are more opportunities for that type of change. If the dynamics are not that high, what type of toolkits do you think of to ensure that this is happening?
Do you have a question also? Can you ask your question also, and then you guys can answer?
Triple threat.
So I think this is probably maybe aligned, but on the other side, I think I'm getting some sense of the level of cooperation that exists with the people who actually have the power to make stuff happen. But what I'm intrigued about is that I think the storefront has been a really interesting place as a nexus to allow different groups to come together. And I'm just curious about what is the future, given that, okay, now you have these plans and you can move forward. What is the infrastructure that's been built to allow some of the groups who were able to get some access and voice through that storefront to continue to have a voice in things as they move forward?
Okay, yeah, I might start with that one first. The storefront is going to become an Italian restaurant, unfortunately, in the near future, which the community is upset about because they already have 2 and they think that's too many. But what we've done is we've started the storefront as a catalyst for the conversation, and that map, that digitized map, all of those comments have been put onto an online open source map, and we plan to give that to the city as part of the general plan. But we've also built a following on Facebook of people talking about, what they want to see in the city. So there's a Resilient South City Facebook page. It's exclusively targeted at people that live in the city. So building that following is gradual, but that will go on, as will the kind of digital issue. And then the map, we hope to find a space that's big enough for it in the city, because interestingly, actually the bank, that space is bigger than other civic buildings in the city. So if we can find a space, there's a lot of people interested in it. In terms of the context of the city, there's a lot of infill development already happening, which is leading to the general plan being redone. People are coming in to the shopfront and they're mostly concerned about parking in downtown. So that might take care of one issue of getting people onto bikes. But actually, it's only the first symptom of a discussion around density and change on that side. There's a lot of sensitivities to development up the creek. So there's a new civic campus, which is up the creek closer to the BART station. What we've tried to do is to be aware of and build that into our network, that work as well as a redo of the main street, but focus on the creek as the most vulnerable point. But all of our network involves a number of those projects that are happening because development's already happening. So we're really focused on just making sure development doesn't happen without this open space, and that open space in the schools are being connected to those who manage flooding and plan for flooding and those who plan for emergencies. We went to a couple of meetings with to talk about the authority of the creek. There's actually a Coma Creek Advisory Commission, different public works departments of the various cities, and we met the emergency operations manager for the city there. He said that was the first meeting of that group he'd ever been to. He was amazed. He'd only just found out about it. So even just this project and that storefront, just connecting agencies within this city, I think has already had a great impact. In terms of mechanisms, one, maybe, I don't know if Alexis, if you want to talk about, look at the report. There's an entire set of spreadsheets at the back that's quite detailed.